Welcome to the fourth episode of the Doon School Podcast. The story of the Doon School started with the story of one man's dream which manifested into an institution which continues to be the leading light in the field of school education. The first term had been very hectic for everyone on campus, including Miss Oliphant, who was in charge of catering and training the servants. By the start of the second term, Miss Oliphant had left to establish the Welham Preparatory School, named after the village in England where she had spent her childhood. She was replaced by Mrs. Germain as dame and Miss Barrett in charge of food. New additions to the teaching staff were Messrs. S.C. Lal, R.L. Mehta, Basir Ali Sheikh, Dr. Bhai, W.L. Clough, and Eric Sproson. Mr. Sudhir Kastgid, a graduate from Tagore's Shantiniketan who was working in Scindia School, came and took over the art school. Dr. Bhai immediately started the weekly, and for nearly 3 years, a typewritten duplicated weekly showcased Mr. Kastgid's brilliant cartoons every week. In March, Mr. and Mrs. Howell, Thomas, arrived, and Barrett's boys moved out of what is now Kashmir House to make room for Thomas's boys. Tata House was not yet ready, so the boys had to camp for some time in the geography room and wash in the chemistry lab. Naturalist and photographic societies had been started during the first term. This term, Mr. Kapoor started the Scouts. The Cubs were run by Mr. Moeen and Mrs. Foote, whose names are permanently linked in school legend by Mr. Moeen's famous exhortation, 3 cheers for Mrs. Hip, Foot, Foot, Foot. When the hockey season started, the school 11 was defeated in its first match by Mrs. Foote's 11, in which Miss Welby and Mr. Martin constituted the right wing. Mrs. Foote's 11 was so elated by its success that it went on to play many other matches with outside teams. It was also soon after Mr. Thomas's arrival that the first midterm holiday took place. It lasted 6 days. There was then only one a year. Mr. Martin advertised a trek from Mussoorie to Chakrata, but with great difficulty got only 6 volunteers. Everyone else preferred tours to Delhi, Lahore, Lucknow and Agra. Mr. Martin felt rather depressed about the future of Himalayanism in the Doon School, and even more so when it took him nearly a week to get his party from Mussoorie to Chakrata. He couldn't have imagined then the remarkable mountaineering feats which the boys and masters of the Doon School were to accomplish in the years to come. More on that in future episodes. Meanwhile, swimming started in a tank opposite the present wellness centre, which was commonly known as the Duck Pond. As the water could only be one level, it was difficult to suit all tastes. At the end of the spring term of 1936, the school produced its first play, Dr. Faustus, in the concert hall, which later became Mr. Kunzru's classroom. Mr. Rashid was Faustus and the producer. The costume of Mephistopheles stayed in the property box for a long time. In the west, Chandbagh estate ended in a ravine covered by an impenetrable thicket. This was later to be the site of the open-air theatre, the Rose Bowl. Beyond the ravine, there was another orchard, and with it is associated a tale of missed opportunity. In 1947, Colonel Kirkwood offered this estate to the Doon School for rupees 90,000. Mr. Foote thought that was steep and waited for the price to drop. Instead, it was sold to the Maharani of Patiala for rupees 1,25,000. She put it up for sale again in 1954. The board again felt the asking price of rupees 4 lakh was too high, and subsequently it was bought over by the Oil and Natural Gas Commission. The reason for both Messrs. Foote and Martin not pressing for it to be bought was not so much a lack of business acumen, but the fact that they both felt the estate was quite adequate for 300 boys, a number considered ideal by both of them. Martin and Barrett's were the first two houses. Mr. Martin initially suggested that the housemaster's houses should be built facing these houses, with the two house dining rooms forming the short sides of an oblong quadrangle where the boys could be locked up at night. The engineer felt that it may not be sufficiently airy. The boys would probably have found ways to break bounds even out of a quad. So the housemaster's houses were constructed facing the main field, which turned out to be a most picturesque layout, giving an uninterrupted view of the magnificent building of the two houses, which came to be eventually known as Hyderabad and Kashmir houses. The Board of Governors had proposed a common dining hall, keeping economy in mind. But both Mr. Foote and Mr. Martin were against it, as they felt that one large dining hall would produce an institutional atmosphere, instead of the homely one they hoped to create. They thought without house dining there would be no house spirit, which is such an important part of the public school ethos. Economy and equality was established by having all food stores purchased centrally and supplied to the houses according to numbers. During the summer holidays of 1936, Mr. Moin, Mr. Clough, Mr. Vishnu Sahe and Mr. Martin trekked from Darjeeling to Gyanse and back. In the third term, that is autumn of 1936, Mr. Vyas and Mr. Muzaffar joined the staff. When acquired, Skinner's estate consisted of lychee groves ending in a big pond full of water lilies and croaking frogs. But by now, the process of converting the lychee groves into playing fields was nearly complete. The Skinners' playing fields were first used in October. In the same month was held the second Founders' Day. It is rather remarkable to think that the whole school as well as the guests were accommodated in the assembly hall. The guest of honour was Sir Harry Haig. In the holidays, Mr. Clough and Miss Higginbottom got married in Allahabad. Miss Higginbottom was the daughter of Dr. Sam Higginbottom, who established the Allahabad Agricultural Institute, which in 1942 became the first institute to offer a degree in agricultural engineering and went on to produce many notable scientists, geneticists, and agricultural engineers. Mr. Foote's son, George Foote, was also born during that time. His advent caused great anxiety to the CID, who kept a watch on messages. When they intercepted a message from Mr. Foote that George was expected in the middle of December, they were convinced that George was a communist agent. The immigration authorities kept a careful watch on the ports, but no suspicious person of this name was reported. Imagine their surprise when they intercepted another telegram from Mr. Foote on December 17th, which said, "George arrived. Both well." Mr. Gibson arrived just before the end of the holidays and was immediately taken by Miss Welby to a shoot at Dimley. Until the end of March, he lived with Mr. Martin, and then, Jaipur House being ready, Mr. Thomas took his boys over there. Mr. Gibson then opened the fourth house, soon to be called Kashmir. In order that it should not be too junior, the other houses had to supply pilgrim fathers. Martin supplied 13, Barrett's 5, and Thomas 2. Their places in the old houses were rapidly filled up by new boys. With the new batch also arrived the new dame, Miss Adcock. Travelling via Chakrata, she brought 2 horses with her. The masters were allowed to hire the horses, and this gave them ideas about riding. Mr. Martin acquired a horse from a Mrs. Nagel at the FRI, and later the Scarlet Nun from Miss Stalin and Moti from Hafazat Hussain. The Foots got a horse quite aptly named the Camel from Colonel Burnett, and Jack Gibson used to have Dr. Andrea's grey mare in the winter months. They had much fun riding. Once when Mr. Martin was about to go riding with Mr. Gibson, he noticed his gardener had cut some branches of bougainvillea for his vases. His sister was due shortly, and he wanted her to see the bougainvillea in all its glory. In his best Hindustani, he told the Mali not to cut the bougainvillea, and the Mali nodded in assent. To their utter dismay, when they returned from the ride, they saw that the bougainvillea had been cut down to the roots. The Mali had followed orders to the T, or so he thought. In May 1937 took place in what the Weekly then described as the longest trip on record. This was actually as far as Rishikesh. The party went a little way above Rishikesh and found a delightful pool and a waterfall in a side stream. Towards the end of the term, Mr. Foote did something which surprised everybody. He addressed the Oriental Society in Urdu. On June 8th of the same year, there was a cyclone at about 8:30 in the evening. Mr. Martin was reading on his veranda when he suddenly noticed a scorpion on a pillar beside him. He took off his shoe in order to hit it, but before the blow fell, the lights went out, and he never knew what happened to that scorpion. There was also a tremendous gale for about 10 minutes, and corrugated sheets from the roofs of Hyderabad and Kashmir houses were carried to the middle of the main field. Tongas were overturned and much damage done to trees. There was no electricity for over a week. Before coming to India, Mr. Martin had not done much climbing on ice and snow. Mr. Gibson, on the other hand, had gone from Cambridge to take up a job as a master at Chillon College in Switzerland, where he immediately joined the Swiss Alpine Club and went on numerous climbing and skiing excursions. So his arrival at Doon immediately made a Himalayan expedition a practical proposition. In the summer holidays, Mr. Gibson and Mr. Martin, with Tenzing Norgay and Rinzing, crossed the Kalandi Khal Pass from Gangotri to Badrinath, though in those days it did not have a name. There was no motorable road beyond Mussoorie or Rishikesh then, and they took 5 days to walk from Mussoorie to Uttarkashi. They were delayed on the outward journey by the non-arrival of inner line passes, and it was while waiting for these that the first reconnaissance of Bandarpunj was made. The approaches to Bandarpunj were to become the scene of climbing exploits of many Doon parties. So much so that Tenzing dubbed it the Doon School Mountain.
The content of this podcast comprises history, anecdotes, and memories regarding the Doon School. The IPSS expressly disclaims any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use this podcast or the information presented in this podcast.